I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Kellie Noon. Kellie is the founder of Kellie & Co, a training provider specialising in global communications and business. She's worked with universities and organisations across the globe, predominantly on cross-cultural management and communications training to enable better integration for teams as well as business growth. Having been an international student herself for 5 years, a university lecturer and a translator working with international students is a core part of the work that Kellie does. Kellie also works as an assessor for the Institute of Translation and Interpreting and regularly supports the charity RefuAid. So it's great to have you with us today, Kellie, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Emma. Such a lovely introduction. Am I okay to just start sharing my screen?
Yeah, it should be fine.
Fantastic. Then I will go on to here, make sure everyone can see what I'm doing. Let's just get this up and running. Okay. Is that all good? Can we see where we are?
That's perfect.
Thank you, Emma, so much. Okay, I'm just going to move things out of the way so we've not got the chat on that screen. Right, Emma, thank you very much for introducing me. It's absolutely lovely to be here today. It was fascinating to hear the talk on AI and, of course, complete change now in terms of looking at communication, which, as we all know, will start to be influenced by AI. So it will all link in quite nicely in the future. I've chosen this topic for you today because, as Emma said, it is a huge passion of mine, and it's the foundation of a lot of the work that I do, both with university clients, but also pathway providers, recruitment consultants as well, because it's often something that's really, really overlooked. But the way that we communicate with people is key to building relationships, to supporting people, and of course, to helping them in all different areas of their lives, not only at the stage where they're looking for graduate roles. And actually, what I'm going to share with you today will be really helpful, not only for when you're dealing with students and university partners, but also in other areas of your lives. So working with different people who are on your teams, different people that you have in your private lives, and so on. It's really, really key skills for all of that. Now, as Emma said, my kind of passion, I suppose, comes from the fact that I am a translator. I do a lot of work around communication and intercultural awareness and understanding. I've lived abroad for a very long time. I've worked with people across different language barriers. But really, really importantly, what I want you to take from this today is that the skills and the ideas that I'm going to share with you are not only for dealing with those people who have other first languages. So quite often when we're communicating, we really do put a lot of focus on making sure that the other person who speaks the other language can learn our language and communicate with us. But actually, communication works both ways. So it's really, really important that we have the skills to be able to make sure that what we do, how we communicate, how we share information is as clear as it can be. So really kind of think about where else you'll be able to use this information as we go through this information today. So what I've just mentioned there is, of course, there's two parts to the communication process. No, we have what we say, and when we think about communication, we normally think about the words that we're using, how we're saying things, the sentences, the phrases, what we're saying, what we're emitting as our message. But equally within that communication process, we've got to be careful to remember that we've got the active listening part as well. So within that communication process, you're also the receiver of a message. And taking time to really think about the message that you're receiving, that you're hearing, is as important as how you communicate or share that message that you want to get across. So I think that's really useful just to start with, because again, it's a piece that often gets really overlooked, forgotten, and people forget that being an active listener is a really, really key part to communicating well and effectively. Now, the other thing to think about, of course, is that communication isn't just the words. It's also all of that non-verbal information that goes alongside the way that we are transmitting our message. So if it's in an email, you might have your emojis, you might have the type of communication that you use in terms of being formal or informal. If you're with somebody in a room, that might be your hand gestures, how close you stand to them. But there's all these different elements that go into communicating. So we've got to take a step back sometimes to have a think about all of those different parts and how they work together to make sure that we're getting our message across as clearly as possible. Now, of course, today we're looking a little bit, well, not looking a little bit, we're looking mostly at how we can support students. But like I said, all of this will help you in different areas as well. Now, one thing I see mostly in the work that I do with universities when we're looking at how we support students in the classroom, but again, the same will go for any communication we're having when we're helping students at different phases of that kind of student journey, is eye contact. Now, alongside all of the different words that we use, and I'll come back to that in a minute, there are a couple of things I want you to remember. One of them is the importance of eye contact and all the non-verbal cues that go alongside what we're saying. Now, here in the UK, often what we find is that maintaining eye contact really helps us to get across our message. It helps us to tell the person we're talking to that we are paying attention, that we're engaged, that we're focused. So maintaining eye contact is really, really important. But actually, what we find with lots of students from around the world is they come from areas where maintaining eye contact is the exact opposite. So it shows us a little bit of arrogance. It shows that there's a bit of mistrust there, and it really can have a negative impact. So we go into situations and we read the fact that students might not be looking directly at us as disengagement, they're not listening, they don't care, they don't respect what we're saying, and quite often it can be the exact opposite. Now, of course, this isn't true in every situation, but it's just one example of a number of many things that we need to start paying attention to and really being aware of as we are communicating with people. So something for you to think about. Another example of this that I'd like you to think about is how we use our turn-taking styles and also how we use silences. So when we have a conversation, of course, generally here in the UK, we are, as we would expect, quite polite in terms of turn-taking. We allow somebody to finish and we carry on the conversation immediately, but we don't interrupt generally or overlap. Now, I spent a really, really long time in Europe. I spent a lot of time with Spanish people who jump in and they talk over each other. And I've taken that on. And I notice that when I'm getting excited or enthusiastic, I'll talk over somebody because I can't wait to share my idea. And it's really, really rude for my British colleagues. But actually what I'm doing and what would happen in Spain is that's a sign of engagement. So remembering how those different turn-taking styles work is also really, really important so that we don't misread some of that communication. Now, this will happen differently all over the world. And there are, of course, areas where students will come from backgrounds where you leave a really big pause in the turn-taking situations. So again, there might be more use of silence, which we might be uncomfortable with if we're not used to it. But these are all different elements that go alongside what we're saying that we've got to take care to read carefully as we go through what the conversation might be or that interaction might be. And of course, all of this comes back to thinking about the culture that our students come from. So when we talk about culture, it could be your local culture, it could be your national culture, it could be your company culture, and that might be part of the conversation we have with students when we're looking for these recruitment places or graduate roles, because culture means different things in different areas. But what I'm talking about in terms of communication is our national culture and how we can start to use some of this information and understanding of intercultural differences to help us communicate more effectively. So just something that I think is a really good example of looking at how communication can be impacted by culture. I've got here a sliding scale, and I'm not sure how many of you in the room will be familiar with the concepts of low context cultures and high context cultures, but this is a very brief whirlwind tour of one idea. This is much more nuanced, much more layered, and much more in depth than what I'm sharing with you right now. But this is just an introductory idea to help us understand what's happening. So we have at one end of this sliding scale, really low context cultures in terms of the communication style. So we have those areas of the world where generally people are really direct and they're really explicit. And you can see there that I've put examples of 3 different places. So North America, Australia, and Canada as examples of places that are really, really direct. Now, because this is a sliding scale, we've got a group of areas or nations which are lower context. So they're still at that end of that scale, and they're generally very direct. And we, as the UK, fall into this group as well. But other examples are, as you can see, Poland and Denmark. Now, people who come from similar areas will have, generally speaking, a similar communication style in terms of how direct they are. So how much information is shared is generally really similar. And when we're dealing with students from these areas of the world, it can tend to be easier to communicate because we have those same reference points and we understand what is considered normal or acceptable in a communication situation. But then we've got the other end of this scale as we get up towards the higher context communication style. And when we have a higher context, I'm actually going to bring them up at the same time so you can see these 2 points. What we have is a really indirect communication style. So where you've got the really, really indirect high context communication style, which you can see on that right-hand side there, examples being China, India, and Korea, what you have is much bigger importance on all of that non-verbal communication. And if you are not from that area and you don't have those same reference points and you don't understand those different communication features, it can be really, really difficult to read what's happening effectively and correctly. So what we need to start to do is take more care to really think about what might be the predominant communication style and what things might we need to pay more attention to help us understand what's really happening, what's really being said or not said. So all of that big rambly introduction is really just to get us kind of situated, ready for these 3 key areas that I'm going to talk through with you today, because I really wanted this session to be quite useful, quite practical, and I want you to have some stuff that you can take away and implement immediately. Now, I've simplified it and kind of tried to keep it really simple, direct, because like I say, I want you to take stuff away from this. But equally, please don't take from this that it's an easy thing to do. What I want you to take away from this is that there is so much more that we can learn and do to really make sure that we're communicating as effectively as possible. Right, so what I've got here are 3 points, which you can see. So we're going to go through these in turn. And for each of the 3 points, I've got 3 small messages that I'd like you to take away. So there should be 9 learning points. But like I say, quite easy ones. So hopefully it'll be really easy to remember. And we'll recap them at the end. So that first point is this active listening. So when I mentioned at the beginning, we've got the 2 sides of that communication, what we actually say, what we emit as the kind of sender of the message. And then the other side, which is what we receive, so that active listening part, that's why I put this first, because this is the bit that people always forget. Now, active listening is easy to do if we take the time to remember to do it, but it can be really, really impactful and make a huge difference to how much we actually take from the communication that we're having. But in order to communicate effectively with our students, we need to do this part first. So things that I think are really key for us to kind of remember and think about when we're actively listening. The first point is not being dissuaded by accents. I see so many people that I work with within the university sector, and again, within private business, it's not only within the sector, who are immediately dissuaded by an accent that they don't recognize. So what we do is we switch off and we stop listening. We say their accent's really difficult, we can't understand that message. But that isn't true. What we need to do is start to practice being a much more comfortable with really tuning into what is the accent of the person that's talking to me? What are some of those sounds that I recognize? But using all of the information that you can to take from the context of the conversation as much information as possible. Because I see so many people switching off, both when I'm working with people here in this country, but when I'm abroad as well, and I'm speaking different languages, people switch off when they assume that they don't know what you're saying. So you've really got to retrain yourself to pay really good attention and not be dissuaded by the accent. It happens a lot, so try to kind of really make more of an effort than you might do. And I know lots of you will, but it's something we do automatically. So just something to be really, really careful with. Now, a second point when we think about active listening is thinking about what the message is that person's trying to tell us. So we might have a really simple interaction. We've asked a student a question and they've said yes. Now, yes can mean loads of different things. So it could mean, yep, I agree. Yes, I understand. I hear you. I'm listening. Please continue. We use yes in our conversations for lots of different meanings, so lots of different uses. But what we've got to be careful with, yes can also mean no. So remember that scale I just showed you of the direct and indirect communication styles. When we get students or colleagues who come from those more indirect communication styles, it can be very rude for them to say no explicitly to people. This depends on a number of factors. And of course, it's much more nuanced than this. But just with the time that we've got, let's just keep it simple and kind of summarize it in that space. But when we hear people saying yes, who come from these more indirect communication styles, what we need to be really careful with is to read between the lines and see if that yes is genuinely a yes, I agree. Yes, this is fantastic. Yes, I'm going to do what you've asked. Yes, I'm going to apply for that job. or if it's a polite yes, because that person feels that they can't say no. So we've got to start taking into consideration all the different factors that might be at play. So has eye contact changed? Has the body language changed a little bit? Has that person talked about something different to change the conversation? Think about what else might be happening around that word that can give us an indication that the person doesn't necessarily mean, yes, fantastic, 100% I'm in. Because we've got to be really, really careful at reading those nuanced pieces around that as well. So taking some time to do that is really, really important. And the final piece in this active listening, and this image is just kind of the idea of repetition. So it was just an image rather than more words. But when we're talking to people, sometimes we get students really pushing. So they might ask us the same question 3 or 4 times because they want a different answer. And they think if they keep asking, we'll tell them that, yes, it's going to be a lot easier than initially said, or whatever that might be. But they're pushing us to give them the answer that they want. But we also have students who might be asking the same question or similar questions. And that really needs to ring alarm bells for us, because what might be happening in that situation is the student hasn't understood what we're saying. They don't agree with what we're saying, but they can't find a polite way to express that. Or they might be completely lost and really need you to start again. But quite often we jump to being frustrated and saying, well, I've told you, well, I've already helped with this. But reading between the lines again, if we hear repetition, if we hear things being asked numerous times, what is that person actually trying to tell us? So really trying to take a step back, read the situation and work out why this thing is happening over and over again. So they're the first 3 things for the active listening. Thinking about what it is that's being asked, think about what that communication style is, and being really careful with the accent as well, not to automatically switch off and not listen, but to really take some time to find points that can help us. So active listening is the first part of any process that we need to be looking at. And then, of course, we've got the active speaking, so transmitting our message. Now, what I find is that generally, if we are multilingual or if we are from a background where we have a different first language, that actually this component comes much more naturally because people have been trained to really think about what it is that they're saying and how. So selecting the words that they say. And unfortunately, we have this wonderful situation where most people around the world speak English. So many native speakers don't necessarily need to invest time in learning and considering how they're speaking. But that causes a problem because it means that actually the native speakers are the ones who cause most of the miscommunication problems because they're not thinking about the words that they use. And if you do what most of us do, which is speak much slower and much louder, you're not going to get any further ahead. So really thinking about how you can communicate more effectively by selecting the words can be really helpful. So again, I've got 3 small, easy points that we can take away that will really make a big difference and have a bigger impact. So you're talking to students, and again, I'm using the conversational example here, but this could be in writing as well. It could be in a formal documentation that you share in any different communication setting. But you might say something really simple, like, that business is wonderful. They meet with clients fairly often. So don't worry if you miss this round of interviews because blah, 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 blah. Now, we're using the phrase here fairly often as an example, but what I want you to take from that is to be very specific in what it is that you're saying. What I understand as fairly often will be completely different to what you understand. And although in theory, the words themselves are simple, they're easy to understand, what is it that we're actually saying? Do we mean weekly, monthly, quarterly? So we've got to be careful to make sure that we're being very explicit with the message that we're transmitting. What are those timeframes? Because timeframes will vary enormously. And of course, lots of other different references to that, but just being really careful to be as explicit as you can is a really easy change that we can all make. Now, a second one, which is a little bit more difficult because it takes a little bit of practice, but it's easy to do once we've got our brains into gear. So an example that I've put on the screen for you here. Today's event has been put off until next week. Imagine you're telling a student this, you're having a conversation with somebody. On the face of it, this is a really simple sentence, small words, easy to understand. But I've got a big problem with one part of this sentence, and that is put off. Now, the combination of put off, we all know, means to postpone. But actually, if you are learning English as a second language, learning all of those different combinations is really quite difficult. Now, most of the students that we deal with will have fantastic English and they'll know this. But if we can just make that communication a little bit easier by replacing these combinations, it can help enormously. So what we have are these two-part verbs, and they're called phrasal verbs. Lots of people in the room, I'm sure, will be really familiar with them because you will be familiar with the language or you have a second language skill already. But they're a combination of a basic verb, so put, go, do, plus a preposition. And that combination creates a whole new meaning. So some more examples of these, just to give you ideas of how we can use them and change them. It's a good idea to look into roles in companies. Look into, well, we might want to say research or investigate. Because look means one thing, I'm looking at the picture, but look into means something completely different. So again, for students to learn those different combinations can be quite tricky. If you're a second language speaker of English, it's a really long process to learn what all of these are. And I've given you some easy examples here, but there are thousands and thousands of these. You'll need to hand in your applications. I hope that you're sat there now thinking of examples of how we can switch this. So hand in, submit could be another option. So what I want you to do is start to replace them with one verb or one word. We've run out of paper copies of this. Some of these phrasal verb combinations have 3 components or 3 parts. So again, you can see that it gets more tricky, more complicated as we work through. So we've run out of paper copies. You might have to find a different way to replace this. So we have no more. There might not be one word, but as much as possible, as you can see in those first 2 examples and the key example at the top to put off, there are in most occasions, in most scenarios, options of one word that we can use to replace it. So that makes your communication much easier. So those first 2 things are our first starting points. Now, the third point that I want you to take away is something that we do all the time. Now, when we looked at that sliding scale, we said that the UK falls into the lower context end, which means that we are generally more direct. But you'll remember I put us in the second group, not the first group, because if you're really direct, you say what you think. If you're less direct, but still quite direct, you like to soften messages. And what we do here in the UK extremely well is try to be overly polite. So we might say, would you mind just holding on for a moment? And we all know that it is not a question. It's not optional. You're just saying to somebody, please hold, please wait. But we're doing it in a way that sounds really, really polite. Now, again, the same will happen with neurodivergent students as well in different scenarios. A lot of these messages can be misread. So it's not only for those students who are international, who have different language backgrounds, but we've got to be careful with the wording that we have if we want to communicate more effectively. And we do this in a number of different ways. So we also have phrases like, could you just, I'm not sure, maybe. And we all have that mutual understanding that these are not necessarily real options. They are requests, and we're telling people that we need them to do something. So if you can replace these with a simple, direct version of what you're saying, it can really help to clarify your message. So could you just give me a minute? Please give me 1 minute. And what we need to do is remove those question forms. And that last one, maybe we should look at other companies. What we're really saying is, you need to look at different options, but we're trying to be polite. We're trying to soften that message. So again, in trying to be nice, we're actually confusing what we're saying. So remember these points. They're really, really easy for us to change, but they can have a huge impact on how well we're communicating with those different students. Okay, and then last but not least, things we can actually do to encourage better communication more generally. So we've looked at that idea of active listening. We've looked at communicating or speaking in a way that's more clear, speaking or writing or whatever style we're using. And now let's look at how we can encourage better communication all around. So again, 3 small points that I think are going to be really, really helpful for you. So the first one is taking time. So make sure that when we're talking to students, we are giving them more time than we might do normally, particularly if you're dealing with students who have a different first language. Processing what you want to say in a second language in a new environment or in a stressful environment takes more time. Thinking about how you want to communicate, thinking about what you want to say is really, really important. And sometimes, especially I know I'm very bad for jumping in. We can jump in. We don't give people enough time to really think about what they want to say and say that. We try to answer the question for them. We try to rush them through the conversation, but give people a little bit more time than you would normally, because it can make an enormous difference. And again, it's easy for us to do. The second point here is thinking carefully about the types of questions that you're asking. So as standard, please never say to somebody, do you understand? Or is that okay? Because of course, we all do this. Your response is, yeah, okay. Because nobody really likes to say, I've got no idea. What is this? I'm sorry, I'm lost. It's very difficult to admit that, particularly in a setting where you're with somebody that should have explained themselves clearly. So you can feel quite rude as well saying that to people. So you've got to take some time to think about how you're asking the questions. So use, if you can, more of your concept checking questions. So what day did I ask you to submit that? Get the student to give you that information. Friday. What time did I say I'm here till? Which room do you need to go to? So you're asking them to give you that information, to feedback, and you can check that they've really understood those concepts. So just rethink some of the questions that you're asking. That can be really, really helpful as well. And then the last point here is thinking a little bit about how we can create situations or environments where students feel supported and safe. So is there a space where they can come and talk to you in an environment where they've built up trust with you, where they know they can ask the right kinds of questions, where they know they're not going to be rushed, where they know that the person talking to them is going to take the time to really consider effectively transmitting that message to them. Because what we don't want is to create a situation where people say, I know there's information there, I know they can help me, but I don't understand them. So you've got to take some time to build up that relationship or trust with those students so that they really get the most out of working with you and you get the most out of working with them as well. So it's just thinking about little changes that you might be able to make to support them. So a whirlwind tour of some different things that I think are really, really important. But let's just recap those 3 points. I'm hoping that you can take these away and implement them almost immediately. So first of all, that listening actively, being really, really careful. So we looked at those points around being careful with accents, so trying not to let your brain switch off, reading between the lines with the words that students answer you with. So we had that example of yes or no, and then thinking about repetition. What might that repetition be telling you? But also as well, what might the silence be telling you? So think about all those different parts when you're actively listening. Carefully communicating, thinking about those different elements that we looked at. So being specific with the words that you use, not leaving room for ambiguity. Removing as much as possible those phrasal verbs and keeping the language simple and direct. It doesn't need to be simple and stripped back of all meaning. It just needs to be direct and clear. And then that third point that we had as well in terms of looking at politeness. So not using would you just, could you just, but trying to be more direct and clear with what it is that you're saying to avoid those possible miscommunication points when we're being overly polite. And then, of course, that third point there around encouraging good systems. So what can we do to encourage an environment where that communication flows much more nicely? So giving students the time to think about what they want to say and asking those questions, being careful with how we formulate the questions that we ask to make sure that we're getting the information that we need, and thinking about how we're creating an environment where people feel that they can ask us honest questions, that they can talk to us, that they can tell us when they don't know what's happening. Because this goes for all those different students that we're dealing with, not only international students, not only students who have different first languages, but domestic students as well. And all of this that we've looked at can equally be applied to working with any of your colleagues, people that you know at home from different places, and all those different scenarios that you're working in. So I hope that that is really, really simple, really clear, but actually extremely effective for you, because what we want to do is you to take away from this some of that information you can then implement day to day and really have a kind of positive impact almost immediately in those interactions that you're having. Thank you, Emma. So I've gone through that a million miles an hour.
It was fantastic.
Of use. Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Yes.
So I can see your lovely.
Yeah, that's great. Then we can chat a bit more. That was fantastic, Kelly. As you can see, I'm a jumper in. I think I'm going to consider a move to Spain. That was great. We've got some lots of questions coming in the chat for you. So there's a great one here. How can we better prepare students from different cultures to enable them to communicate and collaborate effectively in teams and sort of group exercises?
Oh, this is so important. That whoever asked the question, thank you. This is the best thing we should be doing. Yeah, this is a lot of the work that I do, because what we need to be doing with students is effectively giving them that information, those skills to understand intercultural differences. To understand the benefits that we have by being native speakers, quite often, if we're talking about domestic students, but giving them the space and the opportunities to actually learn about intercultural theories and why people might behave in different ways, giving them space alongside all of the maybe widening participation programs that we run and EDI training sessions, but to include that international element in all of the studying that they do, because students who are on programs with friends or colleagues from all over the world, where are the opportunities for them to actually learn about each other? Not just be sat in the classroom together, but can we facilitate workshops, content for them, videos that you share, give them opportunities to learn what is behind the behavior. Why do people tend to behave in one way or another? Because it's a huge learning opportunity. If you're with people in the classroom and you're learning about why we're all different and wonderful, well, then you can ask questions, you can engage. And we all know that that's where learning happens, because that's what you take back. I remember that so-and-so told me this and I learned that and it was really helpful. And then you take that into your working environment. You take that into your interview settings. You go for an interview with an international company and you can say, I'm really excited to work with colleagues from here because I've had experience of this, that, and the other. And it just opens so many doors, and it is so easy to do. Small workshops, small training content sessions, share videos with them. There's a million different ways we can do that, and it is not difficult to do.
So important, such great advice. I think on university campuses, we've got so many different cultures there, and we rarely take time to learn from each other. So I think that's a really great tip. Another question here about any free resources or resources that are really good that are out there to help students understand UK communication styles. Where can we direct our international students?
In all honesty, off the top of my head, there isn't anywhere that I could send you. What I would say is, and it sounds like I'm plugging myself, I'm not really. There are a lot of things that I share on LinkedIn. So there's lots of little free downloads that you can take away that are small pieces that would be a really great starting point. And actually, Emma, I'd be very happy to put some together and also maybe put together a few links of different places that might be a good starting point to share with you, if that can go out in maybe some of the follow-up content or recordings. But off the top of my head, there isn't one place that's great. I mean, a good port of call might be within the universities that you're engaging with, talking to some of their language departments, because while they have quite often the resources and the knowledge in-house, they don't use them. But actually having the conversations could maybe start opening some of those doors to them to share some of that with you. So it might be worth just doing that as well and asking that question.
Fab. Okay, that's super useful, Kellie. And yeah, I can reiterate, Kellie's website is really useful and she does share great stuff on LinkedIn, so do give her a follow. So there's a couple of questions around how we make more space for international students when we've got we're working with them in sort of time restricted appointments. So that's a big concern here, because lots of people on the call will have to get through lots and lots of appointments in the day, and so only have limited time. What can they do to really make the most of that time?
Thank you for asking that, actually, because when I said it, I thought, oh, people are going to think it's a huge change. And I don't mean necessarily giving them double the length. What I mean is, while you're having that conversation, give people 3 or 4 more seconds to respond, so that the change isn't enormous. It's literally seconds. Maybe if you give a student a couple of seconds because you're expecting them to respond, just give them 3 or 4 seconds or 5 seconds. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to craft more time to have those conversations. It might end up being 2 or 3 minutes longer than a normal or usual conversation. But also as well, by adapting some of these different ideas that I've shared with you, it will make that communication much easier anyway. So you're already doing some of that work. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a time intensive scenario that you're looking at.
That's great. Okay, another question from the chat. So how can we translate your information on spoken communication to written communication for the broader group of international students? So what do we need to pay attention to when we're crafting promotional materials or invitations for events, that kind of thing?
So a lot of the similar points that I've said are around being really, really specific with what you're sharing, which you're probably doing in a lot of your materials anyway. And then that second point around phrasal verbs. Now, there are more things that I would recommend that you include there. So thinking carefully about the structure of the sentences that you're creating. So avoiding formal language. I'm trying to say this without making it too linguistic, just because you haven't much time. So it might sound very simplified, but what we tend to use is the passive voice when we're being very formal. So we'll say, I don't know, results will be released on this date, but that's actually grammatically quite a difficult, complex situation for people to read. So if you change the structure of that sentence, results are available on. So keeping your sentences simple in that sense. So trying to use what we call the active voice as much as possible, replacing any phrasal verbs, and then doing lots of really simple things like cutting down the content that you have into bullet points. So not being shy of using shorter lists, repeating your ideas as well. So having a summary at the bottom, making it really clear that people can ask questions, because quite often something that we forget is to give people permission to ask questions or to engage with us. So again, making it really, really clear, if you want to ask a question, please talk to us. So just doing small things like that can actually have a really, really big impact. As well, there's a list somewhere, and it will be somewhere on my LinkedIn, but if not, I'm happy to share it with anyone, of 10 things that we can do to make some of that communication easier. And it's actually so easy to implement and so easy to make those changes. So once you've done it once or twice, it'll be second nature, because none of it is stuff that we don't know. It's just stuff that maybe doesn't come as naturally to us because we're used to making things look formal or serious. And very often people equate clarifying or simplifying a message with dumbing it down. And that isn't the case at all. It's just making it clearer and more direct. There's nothing wrong with using bullet points in a list instead of a big chunk of text that's denser and more difficult. So there's lots of little things like that really can help.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Kellie. There's been so much engagement in the chat on this topic. Obviously something everybody's really interested in, and it's really at the front of everyone's mind. It's really nice to have those little easy reminders and things to think about when you're chatting. There's lots of really good sharing of resources in the chat as well for everyone. So that's been super useful. Thank you so much for sharing all that insight with us. There's lots of praise for you as well. Lots of people say it's a wonderful session in the chat, and shout outs for your workshops as well, which is good to see.